Well, my part's really easy. I'm just going to introduce the people that were up here on the stage earlier today, and each of them gets a shot at telling you in more detail who and what they're all about and their visions. We'll start with my old partner, Ed Catmull. Ed?
Thank you, Alvy. Okay, part two. The first point I want to make is that I absolutely loved my time at Utah. I loved the idea that there was a grand challenge. I loved the idea that it was set up so that each student would make an advance. I loved the way the students worked together and the way they supported each other. And I'd been to enough other places to realize that this was a very special place. I came away with the belief that wherever I went, this was the kind of environment that I wanted. And my first chance was at NYIT. Now, this was the first time in my life that I had ever managed anything. And I had some theories about how to manage a group, based on what I was thinking I was seeing here. I really wanted to do research, so I only wanted to hire people who could manage themselves, so I wouldn't have to do anything. Some of my theories about how to manage a group worked very well, and some of them were a complete crock. On the positive side, the relationships between the people at New York Tech were very good. It really was a great group that working together. The president of the NYIT was fine with us publishing everything because we had made the decision to engage fully with the other academic community. Excuse me. And frankly, excuse me. Let me get some water. Oh, great. Thank you. I'm going to cough my way through, or clear my way through this. We engaged with this community. It grew. I gained lifelong friends as a result of that engagement with people. And I will actually note at the time there were a couple of other companies who wanted to make animated films, but they were very secretive. And I just thought that was a big mistake, that we were much farther away than people thought. And any secret that one might have in the short term kind of didn't make any difference if you're thinking in terms of things that might take 10 or 20 years. That, in fact, the right thing to do was the engagement and getting the best people. On the negative side of my theories, the idea that I was only going to get people who didn't need managing was fundamentally flawed and naive. The first was, I really didn't know what people were like when we hired them. And the second one was, there are a lot of really incredible people. They just need some guidance. And I found that the issues of managing were much more interesting than I'd ever expected. It was actually kind of fun and challenging. You're like, okay, how do people think? What motivates them? I also found that some of my mistakes had backed me into a corner. So, and frankly, I didn't have the experience to know how to get out of the mistakes that I had made. So when George Lucas called, it was a jump at the chance, of course, but it was also a time for a restart. Now, there were some big takeaways I had on leaving New York Tech. One of them was something I mentioned before, which was that you really want to be with people and engaged closely with people who want to use what you produce. And that it wasn't just like something over the wall somewhere far away. We wanted to be close to the people, and that was what we were missing. The second takeaway that I took was about half of my theories about managing were wrong. And, of course, I learned from that. I wasn't going to make the same mistake when I went out there, but I did imagine that I would probably make some new mistakes and that about half of the new things I was going to try to do would be wrong. And that ratio of being wrong half the time would probably continue throughout my life, which it has. Now, in truth, I don't actually know what the real number is, but I do think it's helpful to understand that you're probably wrong more than you think. Again, it's like when you get surprised about your mistakes and you realize, oh, I was wrong again. So we were fortunate in that George Lucas was perfectly fine with us publishing whatever we wanted. His goal was to change the industry. I think people might be surprised that when Pixar was formed, Steve was also fine with us publishing what we did. Now, Steve is known for being very secretive, but Steve also understood that we were playing a different game. That what we were doing was, in participating, is we were making ourselves a place that really good people wanted to come to. And that was always the thing that we did. Be the kind of place that someone else wants to come to. Now, while I was at Lucasfilm early on, I got to go visit a lot of companies, workstation companies. I think at the time there was CDC, but also Cray Computer. And because I was from Lucasfilm, and there was something sexy about Lucasfilm, and Lucasfilm was a potential customer, so what I found was during the daytime, I would meet with the executives of the company and get one picture of the company. But because I have this technical background, in the evening, I'd go out for dinner with the engineers. And I got a completely different story. So, that was very interesting. Incidentally, I can't get away with that anymore. But it was great at the time. And I also noticed that in a lot of companies over a lot of years that a kind of class structure was apparent. And it wasn't something that often they even were aware or talked about, but it was there. I mean, one example would be, this is sometime later, but Disney actually had a technical group, and I met with them and knew who these people were, and they felt like they were second class compared to the artists. And in fact, the artists did think of them as second class. Now, it wasn't imaginary. Both groups knew what their standing was. And there was a point also in which we were producing these storybook CD-ROMs. And so I was aware that at Microsoft, they had hired some artists to make these animated storybook ROMs. And that group of artists felt like they were second class compared to the technical people. Sorry, so it was just inverted. And it wasn't imaginary. It was real. This can't be good. And so it's like, okay, how do we keep from falling into this trap? And we were very careful to make sure that artists that came in, and the first one was really John Lasseter, but as we brought in people over time, that the artists and the technical people were peers with each other. And they thought of each other and valued what the other group did. And so we had the groups close together. They intermingled, they socialized together. They were allowed to intermarry. And that relationship is held up to this day. I mean, it was really awesome that we were able to keep that there. Now, having said that, and being very aware of it, I was surprised at the end of Toy Story that a new group of people we brought in, which are the production managers, at the end of the film said they felt like they were second class. It's like, but they hadn't said anything because, number one, they were excited about it, and number two, normally what they did was they're going from one gig to another. They don't expect to stay in the same company, so speaking out isn't actually a good career move for them. And we were asking them to stay, at which time we learned that they thought they were second class. So then I checked in with the artists and with the technical people, and sure enough, they thought these people were sanding the gears. Okay, so this had crept in there. By the end of the next film, we had changed that. And the perception of the production management was they were very valuable and they were world class. So I would say that there were two big times in the intervening years where it crept back in, where a group would come in and they didn't feel like it was their place to say something. So even though we're on the lookout for it, we'd find it would creep in and it would at some point come in and emerge as a big problem. And so we'd have to go through the process of changing the way we worked to get this out of the culture. But it wasn't an easy thing for us. Okay, so as I mentioned before at Lucasfilm, after about 5 years, George got the divorce, and at that point, we're now in a different mode of thinking because now we have to actually become a separate company, regardless of who ended up buying us, something we hadn't thought about. Steve had acquired us, and now we had to learn about things that we didn't have any experience with in terms of manufacturing and of selling. And we were selling the picture image computer. And it was now this intense learning experience, but it was one of those things where I learned things about manufacturing which I never expected to learn, and which were very important to us. I suppose that's what education is a lot of things that you learn are things you didn't expect to learn. But that's what this was. Like, okay, surprise after surprise. But I also valued the people and what they did, and I could see how, as we grew, we had to ensure that, again, we valued what other people did instead of thinking that, oh, business people are whatever, like these are the guys in suits or whatever. I hated suits, so I didn't wear them. But it's like, trying to keep the stereotypes out. I will say that Steve has always been an important part of the story. In the beginning, it was difficult because he exhibited the behavior that had led to his exit from Apple. And while it's a long story, I watched Steve change over time. And his story is more like the hero's journey. He was cast out, wandering around, making some mistakes, and changing. In fact, I personally thought, well, okay, empathy is probably not one of the things that you can learn. I was wrong, again. In the early 90s, I saw a dramatic change in him. And after that change, the people who were with him stayed with him for the rest of his life. It's one of the reasons why the later things written about him are wrong, because when Steve was alive, nobody was going to psychoanalyze Steve. But that was actually the real thing that we saw, was this dramatic change. And the reason I think this is important, and it's important for students, is that a lot of the written things about him are about the early behavior. And that Steve is not the one that turned Apple around in the end, that made these incredible changes. He was the change Steve who did it. I see get emotional about it. So back to the story of culture at Pixar. Our third film was Toy Story 2. And we were initially following the model that we were taught by Disney and following the model of the studios about how you make films. You have a development department that goes out and looks for scripts. You find a good script and that's what you make. And that's the model we'd started. And we realized in that film, which is our third film, it's after A Bug's Life, that this was actually a trap that we're falling into. We were letting our way being guided by somebody else, and that we needed to have our own way of doing things, and that our films needed to come from us, and they needed to come from the emotion and the experience of the people who were there. So we utterly changed the way we did the development, and we would select somebody within the studio who we thought could be a director and had an emotional ability to do that. And we'd say, we want you to come up with 3 ideas to make into a movie, and we'll give you a year to do it. Now, the reason for 3 ideas is that when you're working on something, you can get stuck. You know this, right? So what we said is, switch the other idea so that you're developing them, so that you can switch back and forth, so you don't bang your head against the wall, but in doing so, it frees you up for what you want to do. And then at the end of the year, they present these 3 ideas to the creative leaders of the company. Now, normally, they would be on the other side because they are the creative leaders, but now they're in a different role. They're presenting their idea. And they would present their 3 ideas, and then they would leave the room while the other creative leaders would discuss which movie to make. Now, the presentation always had the same thing that happened with it. They would start off, before they pitched the ideas, and they would say, I love all 3 ideas equally, and it doesn't matter to me which one you pick. They're lying through their teeth. So when they leave the room, the discussion is not about which is the best idea. It is which is the one they really want to make. And then when we, sometimes it's really obvious and sometimes not so, but then we do it, then there's sort of sigh of relief with, oh, thank goodness, I was hoping that's the one you would pick. And some of our ideas are unusual, like Ratatouille was an unusual idea, as well as Up. I mean, if you make a movie about an old man whose wife has just died and he's depressed and he wants to float away in a house and he's a stowaway, right? It doesn't matter how successful it is, you're never going to sell a lot of toy walkers. And our general feeling is about 1/3 of our movies should fail the elevator test. Now, the basic concept of the elevator test is that you can present an idea very concisely and clearly to a leader in your company so that in a short period of time, they will actually buy into your idea. The best way to get the elevator pitch accepted is to do something that's derivative. And what we needed was something that was not derivative. So in the case of Ratatouille, it wouldn't matter if you had 5 minutes or 5 hours, or 5 weeks, or 5 months, it still seems like a really bad idea. And it's solving the hard problems, which is actually the thing that results in greater creativity. And once we start down a path, we're going to make that film. In the time before I retired, we'd completed 21 of the 22 ideas that we started. So we finish what we start. We've had some difficulties and challenges. We know with a team when they start that they're doing something which is hard, which means we can't judge how well it's working while they're working on it because we know it's hard. So they come back and they say, well, this isn't working yet. Well, of course it's not working. You're just starting with it. So our only measure of a team is what's the spirit in the team? Are they working well together? Are they laughing? Because it isn't working well. But that's the way we try to approach it. And we do have some problems. We've actually made some leadership changes in films necessary, but we're going to solve that problem. Along the way, we also came up with something, because we realized early on that the first group that had made Toy Story and Bug's Life was very special. They were great at problem solving. Andrew Stanton came up with the term, the brain trust. And then as it grew, we realized it wasn't so much a group of people as it was a way of thinking. And so really, these are certain kinds of meetings where there were like 4 rules. One of them was, it's peer-to-peer. The second is, we know the directors are vulnerable because they know they have problems, and we have to make it clear that the brain trust doesn't actually have any authority over what they're doing. They don't tell them how to answer it. They're just giving they're pointing out problems and giving advice, and it's up to them to fix it, but they're not being told what to do. We really work hard to keep the power out of the room. And sometimes it's difficult because there are 2 or 3 people there who either do have the power in the room or they've got powerful voices. And the problem was, if you have power or you've got a powerful voice and you say something, then other people start to adjust and think to it and respond to what you said. So the rule for them is that they have to shut the hell up for the first 15 minutes. It's much better for them to enter a discussion than it is to actually set the tone for it. And the 4th rule is everyone has to be completely honest about what they think. And sometimes it's hard for people. They don't want to embarrass themselves. They don't want to embarrass somebody else if they're worried about it. Now, on top of this, personally, while it's fun to give notes on a film, I didn't view that as my role. My role was, what's the dynamics in the room? Is this working? Usually it works very well. Every once in a while it goes off the rails. I mean, there's personal things that people have got do get in the way. And every once in a while, magic happens. And by magic, I mean the ego has left the room. Ideas come and they go, and people aren't attached to them. And that's it. It's like, if you don't feel like, oh, they're judging me by my idea, then it's okay to say, oh, it doesn't work. That's okay. Here's something else to help. So one other big event was that Disney acquired Pixar, and then I was the president of 2 studios, and I decided immediately to keep the 2 studios separate. I wanted different cultures. I didn't want one does 2D, one does 3D, one does musicals, the other one doesn't. It's like, no, each has their own culture, and they each develop. There were some things, they couldn't do production work for each other. They couldn't bail each other out in a production crisis. But they could beg, borrow, and steal ideas from each other. And the principle was that each studio needed to feel its own identity, but we didn't want either one to feel like there was an existential threat because of what the other did. And there were executives at Disney who were pushing back, saying, okay, we have two studios in the same business. Why are we going to have two research departments, two marketing departments, two HR departments? We duplicated everything, and two different production lines. And from my point of view, it's like that's actually our strength, is that in a fast-moving world, we're far better off if you've got people simultaneously working on different ideas, but having a relationship where they share with each other. Because there is no existential threat, there's no concept of you must use best practices. They know what their ultimate goal is in terms of making a film. And what we found is they formed their own group where they get together and they call each other all the time. And I think we've been very successful in keeping them as separate cultures. So, you know, I could go on for a long time, but I'm wandering around several ideas. But you'll notice that there's a combination of challenges, people, support, and culture. And I think this is because, more than anything else, these were the greatest lessons I learned from Utah. Thank you.